So my name is Anusha Foy. I'm a partner in KPMG in the UK. I lead our life science regulatory solutions practice, and it's a pleasure to have a discussion today with Alan Morrison, who joins us from MSD, who's the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs International, a seasoned regulatory professional with over 30 years of expertise, and also holds an important role as FPA Chair of the FPA Regulatory Strategy Committee and the FPA Brexit Task Force. So it's really a pleasure to have you join our fireside chat today, Alan.
Thank you, Anusha. And maybe you should just add that, the Brexit Task Force are now completed. So thank goodness for that. It was a lot of work, very intense, but I'm no longer the chairperson of the task force, just the strategy committee.
Yeah, that must have been an interesting time, but quite challenging times for the industry.
Extraordinarily challenging and intense, and the initial phase was obviously around regulation, which is why I was chosen to head up the task force. And then when things moved more onto trade in the second phase, once the deal had been announced, then we passed that over to colleagues that were facing trade more than regulation.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Thanks, Alan. And just wanted to open up the discussion by asking what your reflections are of the sector. You've led MSD International Division, huge global coverage for 8 years, but you have a long tenure in the industry and, seen a lot of changes over the last 30 years. So love to hear your reflections on the sector.
Yeah, great. I mean, more from an MSD standpoint, I joined in 2015, and I was part of a broader group of leaders who came over from Amgen under Roger Perlmutter's guidance. And really, there was at that time a very strong initiative to start a transformation within MSD to really take the company from being a primary care company that was focused on small molecules and vaccines to a specialty care company with a modality-independent pipeline and really focused on becoming the leader on oncology. And that was a huge change, for the company in terms of culture, in terms of expertise. It maybe sort of brings us into the second challenge I felt we faced was really that was a challenge of Keytruda. If you look back to 2015 when I joined, that product had one indication. Now it has 36 indications in 16 types of cancer, plus 2 tumor agnostic indications. And it really dictated that we had a completely different way of working than I'd ever seen in any other company, because you effectively were getting filings and approvals every day of the year. There was some activity, and to work on a product that had such a multi-indication potential, so many clinical trials, meant, as I said, it was almost an ongoing process where on every day there was a filing or an approval or a labeling update. And I'd worked on some multi-indication products in the past, anti-TNFs, which maybe had 3 or 4 indications, maybe up to maybe 5 or 6 at most. But this was just completely different. The challenges around labeling, keeping the label up to date, health literacy, all those things. Maybe nice challenges to have, but really did mean that we had to have a completely different way of working, multiple product development teams, multiple filing teams, etc., to be able to take care of the the management of that product. And of course, underpinning all that were a huge number of clinical trials and investment in infrastructure to deliver them. So a big change. The other thing, and probably this is more generally applicable to the industry, was of course in the middle of this period was that we had the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, which meant that everyone had to try and stay focused while really rapidly adapting to working in a completely different way, working from home. We closed most of our facilities. Some of the research labs were open, but it meant that both ourselves and the regulators were adapting to working practices, working with agencies on flexible working, remote monitoring of trials, inspections being done remotely, working through flexible labeling solutions, etc. It really did lead to a kind of paradigm shift in the way that we worked. And as you saw with the COVID vaccines, the way that we develop products, how we were able to expedite those, and companies were able to work in a much more expedited fashion in direct collaboration with regulators. And, you see the timelines associated with the approval of COVID vaccines compared with, what had gone before. I think we had the Ebola vaccine, which was a very short period of development, but was still around five years. That was a real challenge. And then, of course, even the return to work after the COVID pandemic was really, something else we had to deal with, because we had to go back into this kind of hybrid working mode, and people had to adapt to that. So yeah, that was another, hopefully one-off change that the industry had to adapt to. And then maybe a couple of other things I think that we've seen change. And I look at this through my MSD lens, but I think it's probably the same in most companies. There's been a really big change in developing people to keep up with industry trends. If I look in the regulatory space, there's a much more closer convergence with the health technology assessment bodies. AI, I know, is a subject you're very interested in. We didn't really have any expertise in that area. Even more prosaic things, drug device, IVD combinations, require specific regulatory expertise, new classes of product, new technologies, etc. And we've really spent a lot of money and time and money to make sure that we've developed learning systems that allow our staff to be able to develop their skills in this area. And maybe that takes me to the final point. I think I've been very lucky in my career, but in the last 8 years of MSD in particular, to work with some amazing leaders, from people like Ken Fraser down, who really was a very much a statesman, CEO, through I mentioned Roger Perlmutter, who had been also my boss at Amgen, a fantastic individual who really is a luminary in the biopharma R&D space, but also throughout our organization, really to work with very well qualified, extremely talented and committed people at all levels in the organization. And I found that throughout my career, but certainly in the last 8 years at Merck, that's been really very much exemplified. So those would be some of the things I would consider in response to your question. So covering both mainly the time in MSD, but also maybe some broader reflections on the sector as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alan. That's a great analysis, and it's really amazing to think how much has happened just in the last 5 years, 5 to 8 years, and some huge shifts and changes in the sector. So it is, it's amazing, really, just the pace of adoption of technology, as you've said, and yeah, it's fantastic to have your thoughts. I wonder, looking to the future, what do you think would be the main challenges and opportunities for the sector?
Yeah. So maybe I can start here at a very, very high level, at the kind of 50,000 feet view. And I think, I was reflecting on this earlier, that when you look as a company, or any one of the companies in the industry are really focused on the challenge of taking a drug through the system from discovery to access, on an individual basis. And perhaps the real challenge that we need to look at is actually at the healthcare system. So how can that healthcare system bring multiple drugs through to serve patients in a way that's kind of equitable? And I think that's probably the biggest challenge we have, and that one will require obviously a multi collaborative multi-collaborative exercise between the industry, but also the various governments, regulators, payers, health technology assessment bodies, and patients. I think that really needs that kind of co-creation type of approach. And so I think making sure that our healthcare systems are fit for purpose for the future is going to be really important. If I drill down a little bit and then start to look at things from a regulatory perspective, I think one of the challenges we face is that we're kind of moving away from a paradigm where you have a single point in time assessment of an endpoint based analysis to looking at an evolving picture of evidence across a product's life cycle. And I can't remember where I read this, but somebody told me, or I read somewhere recently, that data on any drug doubles every 70 days. So I mean, you're having to deal with huge amounts of change in data and evidence. And I think we've seen this in a change in the decision making that's occurred as well. So it's no longer a single decision over time. You have a multiple points in decision making, from a clinical trial approval, regulatory approval, the HTA approval, the payer and value assessments, and ultimately how patients will uptake on that drug. So I think that kind of approach, the multi-point in time across the drug's life cycle is really quite an important change. And one of the things that will drive that is the use of real-world evidence. And I think we're at a kind of important point here. It's a very important tool in this continuum, as I mentioned, to support and enhance data that's already derived from the gold standard randomized controlled studies. But I think what will be important is we're getting to the point where we really need to develop the appropriate methodologies, tools, and standards that allow us to use that real-world evidence in a kind of standardized way. And I think that's a challenge that we now face. So that's one thing that we will need to continue to work on to facilitate this approach, to make sure there's no bias in the use of the data, etc. So I think that's an important consideration. And then maybe one final thing, and I think very much from a systems or a process point of view, and we'll see in the future, we see it a little bit today, but it's building on this whole concept of a data continuum and a dynamic regulatory assessment. So submission of data in real time when it's available, and assessors being able to pick that up in real time. We've seen it through the COVID pandemic with rolling reviews, but to do this in a more systematic way, was really efficient, particularly when this will be able to be linked to cloud-based computing platforms and data sharing platforms that allow industry and regulators alike to have access to data and be able to see that data real time, assess it. I think that's a very important thing for the efficient submission and assessment of the most innovative products for the future. So I can see some changes in that direction that will be very beneficial to everyone in the system.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Alan. And I think it's so true. I mean, it used to be a very static point in time review of the dossier, and having that dynamic assessment and continuous review of the data and real world evidence is something we're looking at very closely as well as a life science practice and organization. And so the potential for the future is enormous. And, there's been so much fantastic change already. And I think some really exciting changes on the horizon as well. And I wanted to ask you, as chair of the FPA Reg Strategy Committee, I think you've touched on some really important things related to the new pharma regulation in Europe. I know FPA has been very vocal about the new pharma regulation, and there's a lot of changing regulation, and particularly in Europe. So the HTA regulation, we've had the clinical trial regulation, there's the European REACH activities, things, focus on nitrosamines, PFAS, etc. And Europe has also, after MDR, IVDR, it seems like it's struggled really, trying to implement these forward-thinking pieces of legislation, but perhaps stifling R&D investment and growth in Europe. And I wondered what your thoughts are, especially with your, critical role in FPR and all of your industry experience.
Sure. Yeah, I think we could have a webinar on this one question for probably a couple of hours. But yeah, I think you really hit on some of the key points. As you say, I mean, we have a tendency to want to focus on the GPL, but even if one takes a step back and looks at today, we have to deal with a proliferation of existing regulations, and you mentioned most of them, which are impacting, the way that we do clinical trials, the way we develop therapeutics, and you mentioned the EU CTR, the IVDR, the MDR, and the general data protection regulation are all things that are challenges, but they're not challenges in isolation. I think the problem here, or the issue here, is really managing around the interfaces, or I would actually say the lacunae, I think it's a better word, because there's the gaps that between these pieces of legislation, and I don't think when legislation is put in place, particularly very detailed legislation like MDR, they really think about these future-facing interactions, and it causes some issues. So we are seeing definitely some issues between or at the interfaces of these legislation today, particularly with respect to combination products or products with medical devices, products that have trials that are that require the approval of an in vitro diagnostic. But I would say on the positive side, and I try to be positive in this, is that we are seeing the development of stakeholder platforms like the Combine platform, like the ACT-EU. They have been set up to navigate some of these issues, and I think we are making some traction. So we are being able to deal with that complexity, although it always seems a little bit after the fact. I think the initiatives like the Combine platform really have done an amazing job in the last 4 or 5 months. That they've completed the analysis of the issues, and they will put the solutions into place within the next year. So, in terms of a response time, that's pretty good. In terms of the GPL, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, I think, isn't it? It really is an opportunity to create a very flexible, stable, and future-proof and sustainable regulatory infrastructure to deal with the products of the future as well as those of today. While the general pharmaceutical legislation, I think the main issues that have been focused on are really around access, IP, regulatory data protection, and incentives. I feel that having this kind of very stable, very flexible, very well thought out regulatory infrastructure to underpin it all, it's really, that's a capstone of the whole thing. And I often, when I think about this, I think when you sometimes see when you get advertisements for gold, they show you a typical investment platform where you have gold on the bottom, then money, then bonds, then equities. And I think this is the same in terms of our overall European regulatory infrastructure. You have the infrastructure on the bottom, then you have the components of it, the regulatory process, the HTA process, access, IP, RDP. So if you don't have a very solid regulatory platform, these other things won't fall into place. So I do think this is very important, and I think the regulatory, and it's appropriate the regulatory issues get the right level of focus. And I've called some of these out, and it's a little bit kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly here. You have some really interesting things, some things that could be, I think, very detrimental to the investment that you mentioned in your earlier question. So, we have some good things like the regulatory sandbox, particularly if that sandbox can be done or transacted at the level beyond pharmaceuticals. So again, to deal with these interfaces of legislation, so if it can deal with combination products, etc., moving forward, then I think we have a very good opportunity there to create something that's really flexible and future proof. On the more difficult issues, I think one of the things we've seen is the European Parliament are currently considering a proposal for binding evidentiary standards, which kind of conflate or blur the lines between the scientific responsibilities of the regulatory agencies and the kind of socio-economic responsibilities of the HTA payers. And we find this very concerning. And I think it also is moving Europe with that kind of thinking away from perhaps the paradigm for drug development in other ICH and developed regions. So I think this is an important one, and we'll need to have some further discussion and debate around that. But that's something I think really needs to be clarified. We have a focus on expedited pathways. This is something that we've asked for a long time. If you look at the US, they have a full suite of these type of processes, and I think there's been some steps in the right direction. We need expedited pathways, but we need them with robust evidence-based requirements because we really have to bring the most important products to market quickly, but also address, particularly those that address the most profound unmet medical needs, because these will be important therapeutics. But we need to do it in a way where there is confidence in the system, that they're not being brought to market on too small data sets, or regulators have to be able to make confident decisions. So I think having regulatory pathways, expedited pathways that have the appropriate robustness in terms of their ability to ensure the products have the right quality, safety, and efficacy are really important. We're also seeing things like environmental risk assessment considerations being brought into regulatory decision making, both in things like being included in the RMP and maybe more broadly, having other major agencies outside the medicine sphere acting as decision makers and impacting the ability to bring medicines to the patient. So I think there are a lot of these are very new, and we don't always have the expertise in our regulatory functions to deal with this, but these kind of issues are taking up a lot of traction now within companies, within FPA. There's a group looking at this, and I think it's a very, very important area because Europe also wants to manage its strategic autonomy. It wants to ensure there's not any shortages. But, if we have to deal with ongoing issues all the time on things that you mentioned, nitrosamines, PFAS, titanium dioxide, environmental standards, being in regulatory assessments, etc., to do that and maintain a continuity of supply is really going to be very difficult. Another potential positive thing is the use of kind of having a platform technology master file. So could we have a situation in the future? We have product families, I mentioned earlier, macrocyclic peptides, drug antibody conjugates, etc. Could you have some kind of master file where you're able to expedite the development of subsequent molecules based on the platform data being filed? And I think we're at early stages here, and there's many different concepts around those, but the overall concept seems to me like quite an attractive one. So yeah, I think this is those are the main things I would highlight. There are obviously a lot more areas, but those are a few in the few minutes I have here to kind of highlight that I think will be important for that regulatory system to be able to be robust, to be able to be flexible, and enable it to be future proof for these molecules of the future, as I mentioned.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting, Alan, and it's amazing to think, the regulatory professional now, thinking back to 10 years or so ago, but the amount of issues and things that they have to, have expertise in and awareness, and also the, awareness of technology and AI, etc., that's coming. But so it's fascinating, but upskilling in and retaining staff and preparing your regulatory team must be a challenge, and ensuring that they have all the skills to address all of these issues.
Definitely. I mean, and, yeah.
Yeah. And I think we're just about to go into Chinese New Year. So but so happy Chinese New Year. But thinking about this year, I mean, we're already in February. It's amazing how the time is going. But what are you looking forward to this year?
Well, very, very much on a personal level, I'm actually looking forward to retiring.
Oh, Alan,
I plan to retire.
congratulations.
Plan to retire later in 2024. Well, rather, I would say I was plan to semi-retire. I'm hoping I can continue to do some of the externally facing stuff on behalf of MSD at FPA beyond that. So I'm looking forward. I've changed a little bit the focus in my role now, and I'm really focused on a lot of this external engagement. And I'd really like to see the general pharmaceutical legislation discussions. We talked about the Parliament. We'll have the output from the Parliament in March when we go through the co-decision making process with the Council. I'd really like to see the output of that. It's a multi-year process, but I really do hope that we end up with a result that's really been worth all the effort that colleagues in FPA member companies, FPA Secretariat, etc., put into this, because it's been a huge effort, and I think it's a once in a lifetime opportunity.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And no, congratulations on, your plans for retirement. And I think it would be fantastic for you to carry on with all of your expertise and to, contribute to all of the discussions at the European level, and to have FPR as a strong voice for the sector, I think is really important. And they've raised a lot of important issues. So there's a huge potential there to transform patient care and ensure European patients aren't left behind with R&D and launch of new medicines, etc. And thinking about the next 5 years, I mean, there's so many things that are changing, technology, new modalities of treatment. What do you think could be the most transformative for patient care in the next 5 years?
It's a very difficult one to answer. I mean, as you say, there's so many. I think maybe a couple of things, maybe a couple of broad things, maybe one or two more specific points. That one of the things we see is that science never stands still, and I talked earlier about the impact of checkpoint inhibitors. I mean, being able to deliver results in cancer, like results in first line non-small cell lung cancer, for example, that one would have just never thought possible a few years ago. So that shows, how quickly these products have been developed, and there's many of them now. And we're moving into other families in cancer. I mentioned drug antibody conjugates as well. So that's maybe a past success story, but we'll have some future implications. I think we'll moving forward. Science and technology have been really allowing us to do things that are very different. I mentioned that MSD moved from being a small molecule company and didn't really get into biologics until the last 8 or 9 years. But now you have the technology now to go back and actually replace biologics with small molecules, through platforms like microcyclic peptides, and these are able to interdict both extracellular and intracellular targets better than biologicals, with better cell permeability, better tissue penetration, and potentially at lower costs, which benefit the healthcare system that I mentioned earlier as well. So that just shows again how science can potentially develop better solutions. I mean, I look at things like elimination of diseases as well. A combination of HPV vaccines and screening can eliminate cervical cancer, and has as well on the way to doing that in many countries. So and then we're seeing drugs for weight loss, etc., having huge impacts in obesity and associated morbidities and mortalities. So it just seems amazing that across the board, not just oncology, but in vaccines, in general medicine, we're seeing a kind of renaissance of amazing products with treating diseases that you would not think would have been treatable maybe 10 years ago. And then maybe one final thing, and we touched upon it earlier, but I do believe that AI, generative AI, machine learning, is just, I mean, I think where we are even from a year ago within the industry, and that is just kind of really off the charts in terms of its kind of exponential kind of progression. I mean, both in the patient setting, the diagnosis or the diagnosis or treatment selection or patient monitoring, etc., but also to the way that we discover and develop new drugs. So I think that will have a transformative effect, and it already has. And even at a very kind of sort of minor level, I mean, one of my direct reports last year just made a thing in her goal set to give every one of her staff members an AI goal to do to something with AI that would make their job more efficient. So I do think that will be transformative, and both for patients, but also in the way that we work internally. And so I think a combination of science, computing, the combination of that is very powerful, isn't it? And it will bring new products, new targets to the market much more quickly. So I think those would be some of the things that I would see happening.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's such an exciting time. And we work from tech startup companies developing, novel AI technology to healthcare, global pharmaceutical companies. And the technology and the advances in science and the combination of those is so exciting for the future. So it's a fantastic time to be in the life science sector, I think, but some real potential for huge impact to improve patients' lives. So
Definitely.
thank you so much. Well, it's such a pleasure to talk to you, Alan, and to hear all of your reflections and all of the work that you've done with MSD. And MSD is such an important organisation and some fantastic achievements with the products that you have in the market. And also, you know, your work with FPO is so important, that you have that voice of the sector trying to raise those opinions and important reflections to the regulators as well. So fantastic to talk with you today. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
And me. Thanks, Anusha. I appreciate it.